Alright, away we go for learning objective 2. This will be quite a lengthy one, so get some popcorn, paper, pen, and get ready to have some fun discussing how Sam Adams used the key events from the Stamp Act in 1765 until the Second Continental Congress of 1775 to manipulate the society into American war for independence. So, more than any individual, Sam Adams was responsible for the course America took after 1765. Like all successful revolutionaries, Adams was a Machiavellian, a political doctrine which denies the relevance of morality in political affairs and holds that expediency and manipulation are justified in pursuing and holding political power. Basically, the ends justify the means, is what Sam Adams would have believed. He relied upon the principle of demagoguery, manipulation, and even terrorism. If you watch the episode of John Adams, the tarring and feathering was a form of terrorism, and we'll discuss that later. Most of the American Revolutionary War period, most of the leaders were successful merchants and professional men. Sam Adams, by contrast, failed in pretty much everything he tried except revolutionary politics. Adams was born in 1722. His father was a well-to-do owner of a malting house or brewery and was active in the Boston Caucus Club. Educated at Harvard, he tried a variety of occupations such as theology, law, accounting, and even lost his father's malting business before going into public service. In 1746, Sam started to get into public life at the bottom by being elected to the local postal clerk of the town market. In 1753, he moved up to the job of town scavenger. By 1756, he became a tax collector for the town of Boston, and a post he held until 1764. These local offices were important for many reasons. They gave him the opportunity to be in constant contact with the common people of Boston. So he was very well known in Boston. He was definitely a people's person. He got along with most people that he got around. Was around unless it was a political enemy. For instance, he built friendships by being a most generous tax collector in that he was reluctant to perform the duties of his office, especially when citizens were in dire financial straits. When he quit his post in 1764, he was 8,000 pounds in debt of his collections. Sam was one of the rare individuals to whom most meant nothing, and only a practical wife and generous friends kept his personal affairs going. In 1765, he was elected as one of the 4 members from Boston to Massachusetts House of Representatives. The following year, the House elected him its secretary post, which he held until 1780. In the meantime, he was admitted, as his father before him, to the Caucus Club. The Caucus Club membership consisted of individuals who controlled the inner circle of Boston politics, where Adams' ability as a propagandist soon made him a leader. During the Stamp Act crisis, he turned the Caucus Club into the Sons of Liberty and added mob violence to their backroom activities. With his abilities, Adams united and controlled the mob, so that from 1765, the mob was Sam Adams' militia, basically. There is no doubt that he was responsible for the Stamp Act riots in Boston and the destruction of the home of his old enemy, Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson. Sam's father was financially ruined in the 1740s by a land bank scheme largely through the work of Tom Hutchinson and his father. Hence, so he had an axe to grind basically with the man. Hence, during the Stamp Act crisis, Sam contributed a very important line of communication to colonial unity. the Sons of Liberty was first organized in Boston and developed into an intercolonial organization with 12 of the 13 colonies, all except Georgia, developing a branch. Adams made it an effective political tool. He used it to control the mob and kill participation by any government official in Massachusetts in the Stamp Act and other acts passed by Parliament. Sam Adams' contribution to the revolutionary movement did not lie solely in his ability to use the mob. He was constantly on the lookout for men who could add something to the movement, such as wealth, intellect, or respectability. Among his protégés were two young physicians, Joseph Warren and Benjamin Church. Also included were a couple of outstanding lawyers who gave much of their legal and literary talents to the cause. The lawyers were John Adams and Josiah Quincy. The prize catch was a young merchant who had inherited a large fortune from his uncle, but whose craving for fame and popularity far exceeded his love of money. This gentleman's name was John Hancock. And John Hancock added a great deal of power to the revolutionary cause and towards the movement towards independence. After Sam Adams gave John Hancock what he craved by engineering his election to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1766, and so this is where he really gets his start in politics. After the election, Sam told John Adams that Boston had done a very wise thing. They had, quote, made that young man's fortune their own. However, Sam did not neglect the lower classes in his search for talent. Paul Revere, an artisan, and Ebenezer McIntosh, the chief bully of the South End mob, are only the most famous examples of the class that formed the bulk of Adams' following. So basically the street people or the mob were made up of overwhelmingly of poor or marginally employed young men who were often social outcasts to some degree by virtue of class, occupation, or race. For example, seamen were always suspect because they belonged to no community, but merely came in and went, and were always prominent in riotous crowds. These fringe groups did the dirty work of the Stamp Act riots and the Stamp Act crisis, and were also the ones who fought the soldiers in the streets and who were killed in the Boston Massacre. John Adams, who thought little of the mob of Boston, described them as Negroes, mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jack-tars. It's a famous quote of his, just describing the kind of outcast group that Sam Adams had readily at his disposal. Very few men in the 18th century could make their way as petty politicians, living each hour by currying favor with the people. It might have been different had the modest Adams family fortune not been decimated by the land bank fiasco, but that is conjecture, and it appears both out of necessity and temperament, Sam Adams reached out and touched the poorest sort. So he was most likely sincere in his efforts, but then again, he was one of those types that would succumb to the adage, the ends justify the means. So during the crisis that created by the Townshend Acts of 1767, Sam wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter of 1768, which informed the Assembly of the other 12 colonies of the steps taken by Massachusetts General Court. The letter also denounced the Townshend Acts as violating the principle of no taxation without representation, attacked Parliament for its inability to represent American interests, and concluded by soliciting proposals for united action. Part of that united action was the all-encompassing power of the boycott or non-importation association which was the arm of the Non-Importation Association, which was created by Massachusetts under his leadership. And this was directly responsible for dropping trade with Great Britain by 1769 by 700,000 pounds. Thus, during the crisis after the Townshend Acts were passed, Sam Adams contributed an additional 2 lines of communication to unify the colonies with his circular letters and the Non-Importation Association. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. This is something that Sam Adams directly contributed to unifying the colonies. The circular letters, which is basically letters just saying, hey, what's going on over there? This is what we're doing. This is what you should do. And the Non-Importation Association, which was an organization that enforced and promoted the boycotts against British goods. So after the repeal of the Townshend Acts, the tensions between the colonies and England relaxed. There were still enough incidences in the next 2 years, however, to give agitators like Sam Adams a chance to keep American rebellionists alive. The most inflammatory was the Boston Massacre of March 5th, 1770, which American propagandists exploited to the hilt. Minor clashes between citizens and soldiers were common occurrences in Boston following the arrival of 4,000 British troops. Boston only had a population of 16,000, so 25% of the population now was soldiers in October of 1768. No doubt aggravated by the prolonged winter, which brought unemployment as well as discomfort, conflict between the town laborers and soldiers seeking employment in off-duty hours became frequent. And this is an important point to keep in mind. So the soldiers during their off time are able to take jobs, and they're able to take jobs at a lower rate because they don't need to take a wage at a competitive level. They can take the wage at a lower level. So this caused all sorts of tension between people living in Boston and the soldiers. And also they provided a competition in sexuality too. Here were these young single men in uniforms, and so you would have conflict between those young men and the young men of living in Boston. So conflict was constant after 1768. No doubt aggravated by the prolonged winter. On the afternoon of March 5th, getting to back to the Boston Massacre, it basically started as a fist fight between a worker and a British soldier, and which quickly became a small riot. That evening, belligerent and drunk bands of both civilians and soldiers roamed the streets of Boston. The pent-up tension exploded about 9 p.m. when a handful of hecklers, some of whom were fresh from a tavern with a pretty good buzz on, started cursing and throwing snowballs at the sentry on duty near the State House on King Street. When the mob swelled in the numbers to about 60, the sentry called for support, which was led by Captain Thomas Preston. As the mob pressed closer, the soldiers fired upon the command of a person never identified, killing 3 outright and wounding 2 mortally. A general uprising was averted only when Governor Hutchinson bowed to demand that Sam Adams bowed to Sam Adams' demand to withdraw troops from the town to the island and the harbor. So tensions were brought down at that point. And here's a quick depiction of the Boston Massacre. Basically what we're having here is John Adams coming on the scene as a riot is breaking out and the shots are just about to be fired. So we missed the actual carnage of the Boston Massacre, but we see John Adams coming up on the scene here.
free.
My son.
It's your boy.
Murderers!
Come away. Come away, Sam!
Shoot me too, Preston. It's good.
Sam! Sam, come away!
You'll suffer the full penalty of the law!
Sam! These people need to be tended to. These people need our help, Sam. Yes?
So the guy yelling, "Murderers, murderers," that was Sam Adams, and the guy trying to help everybody, that was John Adams. His cousin, John Adams, would later become the second president of the United States. So after the shooting, Sam Adams quickly spread the word. John Adams found his cousin that evening cooking up paragraphs, articles, and occurrence, etc., working the political machine. It's like a very famous quote of John Adams describing Sam Adams' work. And first and foremost, describing this as a massacre. It was a tragedy, no doubt, but even though the term massacre really demonstrates the effectiveness of Sam Adams' ability. And you see this very famous depiction of the Boston Massacre. It appears here that the soldiers, in broad daylight even, not in even the middle of the night, are just firing indiscriminately in a crowd that was most likely just minding its own business. When in truth, this crowd that the soldiers fired upon were antagonizing the soldiers. It's not an excuse that soldiers fired upon them, but it does explain some circumstances of why the soldiers felt it necessary to fire into the crowd. So as you'll see in the episode, John Adams defends these soldiers and gets most of the soldiers off. And it was after the trial, basically a post-massacre truce settled over Boston and the rest of the English colonies until about 1772. It was during this 2-year period that no serious crisis erupted, and imports of British goods were up nearly 50% from before the non-importation agreement, or the boycott. So long as English continued to be okay and respectable to the colonists, everybody seemed satisfied with their place in the empire. During this period of comparative calm, though, Sam carried on almost alone. So between 1770 and 1772, he continued with about 40 articles to newspapers, enunciating many of the basic arguments that later became familiar in revolutionary doctrine, and trying to keep the issues of revolution alive before the people. In 1772, this informal truce ended and new troubles broke out. In June of 1772, that the new governor, Thomas Hutchinson, announced that he would receive his salary from the crown. And in September, it was announced that judges of the Superior Court would be paid from custom receipts, not by legislative appropriations. Since control of the salaries of royal offices gave legislators a somewhat powerful hold over the officials, this development was disturbing. And the reason why it was going to customs are taxes that need to be paid on imports and exports. And so this was a direct, this was basically trying to dissuade any future boycotts, because if you were brought into a court for whatever reason, the judges, and you were responsible for organizing boycotts or participated in boycotts, the judges might know that about you, right? And so they might not be favorable about why you were there, and so this becomes a problem. This incident gave Sam the opportunity he had hoped for to introduce his idea of the Intercolonial Committees of Correspondence, the Intercolonial Committees of Correspondence. Let's go back to this slide here so you have the outline in front of you. So November 2nd, 1772, Sam Adams used the salary issue as a pretext to secure the appointment of a 21-man standing committee of correspondence to communicate Boston's position to other towns in Massachusetts and to the world, as he would put it, with the request that the other towns reciprocate. By January of 1773, 100 towns had formed committees of correspondence. The committees of correspondence were probably the greatest contribution of Sam Adams to the revolutionary movement. The committees were perfectly legal, for they were regularly chosen by voters at town meetings. Their avowed purpose was simply to communicate the sentiments of each town, but it gave the Boston radicals a chance to disseminate their views throughout the colonies for the first time. Thus, Sam Adams built a propaganda machine and ultimately a true revolutionary organization. Later, other revolutionists would adopt this underground technique in establishing cells. Most of all, the Committee of Correspondence brought unity to the revolutionary movement. With the information gathered from the local committees, the Boston Committee could act as a central command post, issuing orders for local action and coordinating the effort of the whole. And by the end of 1774, all of the colonies had formed a standing committee of correspondence. And so this was a direct line of how people all throughout the 13 colonies were, what they were undergoing, what their reactions were to various British policies. The lull in agitation that followed the 1770 repeal of the Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre came to an abrupt end with the Tea Act. So by early 1773, the British East India Company held a monopoly on all trade between India and the rest of the empire and was on the verge of bankruptcy. This was no ordinary commercial venture by a gigantic monopoly to which the English government had entrusted not only the economic exploitation but even the government of India. There were many influential Englishmen deeply involved in the company's fortunes, and like the English government, the company was shot through with corruption and mismanagement. Consequently, the company appealed to Parliament for aid, after which Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, which allowed colonies, which eliminated the export tax on all tea exported from England to American colonies, allowed the company to sell directly in America through its own agents, and obliged up to this time to sell its tea at public auction in England, thereby eliminating both English and American wholesalers. The act allowed the company to undersell both the law-abiding colonial merchants who had bought tea through middlemen at higher prices, and the colonial smugglers who brought tea from Holland. Also, the savings would permit a sharp reduction of the retail price and at the same time yield a very nice profit for the company. The Townshend tax was retained to preserve the principle of Parliament's right to tax the colonies. Now, colonial opposition to the Tea Act centered not upon the duty, which was now 6 years old, but upon the threat of monopoly. If Parliament could bestow a tea monopoly of the East India Company, what was to stop it from getting into similar monopolies over other commodities like hemp, indigo, rice, sugar, slaves? So colonial reaction to the Tea Act took various forms. In Charleston, the tea was landed, but not offered for sale. At Philadelphia and New York, the consignments were rejected and returned to England. But in Boston, as we all know, we have the Boston Tea Party, which was led by Sam Adams. Boston Governor Thomas Hutchinson would not allow the tea ships to depart from the harbor as they had in Philadelphia and New York. Hutchinson decided to seize the tea for non-payment of the 3 cents per pound tax on the tea. Thus, the royal government of Massachusetts, rather than a more vulnerable private company, would unload the tea. It was a clever idea, but Sam Adams had a better one that we all know. We all know about this one. On the 16th of December, some 8,000 people assembled and near Boston's Old South Church and learned of Hutchinson's final refusal to allow the tea ships to leave. Thereupon, a signal for Adams and the group of the Sons of Liberty, dressed like Indians and filled with rum, went to the wharf, where they boarded the 3 tea ships and dumped all 342 chests of tea into the harbor, to the rousing cheers of the large crowd. So you just have a bunch of basically drunk men dressed up as Indians dumping what would be the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars of commodities into the Boston harbor. And Adams knew what he was doing. He knew that England could not let this incident pass. He gambled that Parliament would overreact, and it did by passing the Coercive Acts. The significance of the Coercive Acts is that they got England to do just what Sam Adams wanted it to do: punish the colonists of Massachusetts in hopes that it would gain support of other colonies. This would force the people of Massachusetts to take a stand against England. So in England, they were known as the Coercive Acts, and in the colonies, they were known as the Intolerable Acts. And I have them listed right here so you can take a look at them. Although the popular leaders, including Sam Adams, regarded the Intolerable Acts as a mechanism by which they might achieve a more tenacious and unified colonial resistance, they quickly realized that they needed to proceed with caution. Many conservatives throughout the colonies felt that Sam Adams went a little bit too far in destroying private property. In order to sidestep and avoid all of this, Sam Adams basically kept writing for a complete boycott of all British goods at this time. And so after this incident, although it is going to be something that's going to really unify the colonists, because these various laws are just going way too far, Sam Adams is going to begin to lose favor amongst respectable political operatives within the colonies, because they feel that he's basically a loose cannon. And in order to sidestep and avoid Sam Adams' appeal for immediate non-importation or boycott, on May 17, 1774, the citizens of Providence, Rhode Island, the first of many cities, called for an intercolonial congress to discuss possible common strategies against the Intolerable Acts. Rhode Island's proposal met with almost universal consent, and 12 of the 13 colonies, all but Georgia, sent representatives to the meeting, which was known as the First Continental Congress. During the crisis created by the Tea Act, Sam's contribution to this unification was that the important Boston Tea Party, which forced England's hand and led to a series of actions which began a point of no return for both England and the colonists. So basically, Sam Adams precipitated a schoolyard fight, right? And now the first punch has been thrown and the fight is really on. And so there's no backing out of this fight. The First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 26, 1774. After considerable bickering, the Congress was able to agree on just about 4 things. The first was a petition sent to Parliament entitled Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The declaration summed up anew in a list of colonial grievances the traditional arguments of the American protest. It denounced the Intolerable Acts and asked that harmony be restored between the two parties. Basically, let's get to the table. Second, To protect themselves and give weight to their declaration, the colonists advocated troops be raised in each colony for self-protection. Third, the Congress suggested a non-importation policy be enlarged to include an embargo on all exports to England, Ireland, and the British West Indies. And at the same time, the Congress organized a Continental Association to make sure that there would be no economic intercourse of any kind with England. Most notable were those clauses establishing extra-legal machinery for enforcement. A committee was to be elected in each county, town, and city to enforce the association's position, so to basically enforce the boycott. So if people were trading with England on items that were declared illegal to trade with England according to this Congress, then they would be enforced. There would be somebody that would tell them not to do that. Violators were to be punished by publicity and boycott. So they would be shamed, and then their businesses would be boycotted by all sorts of other people. Finally, having completed their business, Congress adjourned in October 2nd, 1774, but before doing so, they agreed to meet again the following May if colonial grievances had not been redressed, which would lead to the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress was called on May 10th, 1775, less than a month after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The Congress met in June at Philadelphia with 65 delegates from 12 colonies. Georgia joined in September 1775. The delegates to the Congress were to continue to serve with a brief recess for the next 14 years. During the first 6 years, 1775 to 1781, they had no constitutional authority and were thus an extra-legal government. There were three distinct factions present at the Congress, which included delegates who hoped for peace between basically the colonies and England. There were the popular leaders like Sam Adams, who wanted basically an armed rebellion. And then there were the moderates who believed that there might be a show of force needed, but they felt that independence was neither desirable or necessary at this point. On the first measures that the Congress enacted was to create a Continental Army by asking the various states to raise troops to meet the need, and selected George Washington to head this hastily impoverished army beginning in Boston, and indeed was. We'll get a sense of that with the John Adams episode, basically how this was just kind of slapped together. On June 17, 1775, 2 days after Washington was asked to command the Continental Army, one of the bloodiest battles of the war took place, called Bunker Hill, actually adjacent to Breed's Hill. The British won the battle but suffered heavy losses. They lost 1,150 men to 441 of the colonists. Although the colonial leader, General Joseph Warren, was killed, the battle demonstrated the colonists' tenacity and purpose. Following Bunker Hill, the king slammed the door on all hope for reconciliation and decided that a full-fledged war was the only way to settle the problem with the colonists. And so the American War for Independence begins. Well, that concludes the learning objective. Thank you for sticking with me on this. This was a long one, but it had plenty of important information. So do let me know if you have any questions or concerns, either by email or in class. I'll talk to you guys later.